Somewhere in the northern woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, there is a road cut through the forest that does not lead anywhere. It is 70 feet wide and 28 miles long. It runs in a straight line through stands of birch and pine, across frozen creeks and boggy lowlands, through country so remote that the nearest town, Republic, Michigan, population fewer than 2,000, is itself barely a dot on the state highway map. If you drove this road in summer, you would see wildflowers growing where the trees used to be, and grass and sedge. If you drove it in winter, you would see nothing but snow and silence and the stumps of trees that were cut decades ago and never grew back. Along the center of this clearing, spaced at regular intervals, stand utility poles. They look like ordinary power line poles, creosote-treated wood, 40 feet tall with crossarms and insulators at the top. The wire strung between them looks like ordinary electrical cable. There is no sign explaining what the poles carry. There is no fence. There is no guard shack. There is nothing to indicate that the cable on those poles is not part of the Upper Peninsula's rural electrical grid. Nothing to suggest that it connects to anything more interesting than a farmhouse or a logging camp. It does not connect to a farmhouse. It does not connect to anything on the surface of the earth that matters. The cable on those poles is an antenna, 28 miles of it. It is the longest single antenna element ever constructed by the United States military for operational use, and its purpose was to do something that the laws of physics said was nearly impossible: send a radio message through the ocean to a submarine hundreds of feet below the surface, thousands of miles away, without the submarine ever having to come up. The message traveled at 3 characters per minute. It consisted of a 3-letter code, nothing more. A coded instruction that told the submarine commander to surface for further orders, or to change patrol area, or to execute a specific pre-planned action. The entire content of the message could fit on a post-it note. It took 15 minutes to transmit. The transmitter consumed 2.6 million watts of electrical power to produce it. Of that 2.6 million watts, approximately 8 watts, actually radiated into the atmosphere as a usable signal. The rest was absorbed by the ground, converted to heat, dissipated into the ancient Precambrian bedrock of the Canadian Shield that lay beneath the Michigan forest like the spine of a continent.
8 watts. The power of a small LED light bulb, broadcast from an antenna longer than the island of Manhattan, to reach a submarine that was deeper than any radio signal had ever penetrated, carrying a message shorter than a tweet. This is the story of Project ELF, the most absurd, the most ingenious, and the most terrifying communication system ever built. A system designed for one purpose: to ensure that if the Soviet Union launched a nuclear first strike against the United States, the American submarine fleet, lurking silently in the deep ocean, beyond the reach of Soviet detection, carrying enough nuclear warheads to destroy civilization, would receive the order to fire back. The system existed because of one single irreducible fact of physics that no amount of engineering genius could circumvent. Radio waves do not travel through seawater. Not in any useful way. Not at any frequency that a conventional transmitter can produce. The ocean is, to ordinary radio signals, as opaque as lead. And the submarines that carried America's nuclear deterrent lived in the ocean, hundreds of feet below the surface, for months at a time. They were the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal, and the United States could not talk to them. The solution to this problem took 30 years, cost billions of dollars, required the construction of an antenna that was originally supposed to cover 2/5 of the state of Wisconsin, and ultimately produced a system that could send 3 characters per minute using the electrical power of a small city to generate the output of a flashlight. It was insane. It was necessary, and it worked. But this story does not begin in the Cold War. It begins in a war that most people think had nothing to do with radio physics, the Second World War. in the engine rooms and conning towers and radio shacks of the submarines that fought the Pacific Campaign, where the problem of talking to a submerged boat was not a theoretical concern, but a daily operational crisis that cost lives, missed targets, and nearly lost entire submarine patrols.
In 1943, the United States Navy was fighting the most successful submarine campaign in history, and it was fighting it nearly blind. The American fleet submarines that prowled the Western Pacific, the Gatto-class and Balao-class boats powered by Fairbanks-Morse diesels, crewed by men who lived for months in steel tubes, operated under a communication regime that would have been familiar to a sailor in 1918. When a submarine was on the surface, it could communicate by radio. Its transmitter could reach Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, Australia, or wherever the submarine command was based. When the submarine submerged, it went silent, completely silent. The radio could not transmit through water. It could not receive through water. The moment the boat slipped beneath the waves, the crew was cut off from the rest of the Navy, from the rest of the war, from the rest of the human race. This mattered for reasons that were immediate and tactical. Intelligence decoded Japanese shipping routes, convoy schedules, weather data, mine locations, was time-sensitive. Ultra-decrypts from broken Japanese codes could tell a submarine commander exactly where a convoy would be, at what time, on what course. But the intelligence was useless if the submarine could not receive it. A boat that had submerged to avoid a Japanese patrol plane might stay underwater for 12 or 18 hours, during which time the convoy it was supposed to intercept had passed beyond reach. When the boat surfaced and received the delayed intelligence, the opportunity was gone.
The Navy developed VLF, Very Low Frequency Communication, during the war specifically for this problem. VLF transmitters, operating at frequencies between 3 and 30 kHz, broadcast powerful signals that could penetrate seawater to a depth of roughly 10 to 30 meters. The massive VLF transmitter at Jim Creek, Washington, with its antenna strung between two mountains across a valley, could reach submarines across the Pacific. But the submarines could only receive VLF signals if they were shallow, just below the surface, trailing a wire antenna that dangled in the water near the top. This meant rising from deep patrol depth, slowing to antenna deployment speed, and operating in a configuration that made the submarine vulnerable to detection by Japanese aircraft and surface ships. Every VLF reception window was a calculated risk. The submarine commander balanced the value of fresh intelligence against the danger of being caught shallow by an enemy that was actively hunting him. Some commanders stayed deep and missed the messages. Some came up too often and were spotted. The tension between communication and concealment was never resolved during the war. It was managed imperfectly by brave men making judgment calls in real time. The German U-boats faced the same problem from the opposite side. Donitz's submarine fleet depended on high-frequency radio communication. The BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, broadcast orders to the Wolfpacks on HF frequencies that required the U-boats to surface to receive and transmit. The act of surfacing to communicate was one of the primary vulnerabilities that Allied forces exploited. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF, nicknamed Huff-Duff, allowed Allied escorts to locate a transmitting U-boat by triangulating its radio emissions. Every time a U-boat surfaced to send or receive a message, it risked detection. The communication system that coordinated the Wolfpacks also betrayed them. The lesson of both theaters was identical. The act of communicating killed submarines. A submerged submarine was safe. A communicating submarine was vulnerable. And the deeper the submarine could remain while still receiving orders, the safer it was. This insight, born in the combat experience of the Pacific and Atlantic submarine campaigns of 1942 to 1945, was the seed from which Project ELF would grow 20 years later into the most extraordinary radio system ever built.
The problem begins with the physics of electromagnetic radiation and seawater. Radio waves are electromagnetic radiation, the same fundamental phenomenon as light, infrared radiation, and X-rays, differing only in frequency. A commercial AM radio station broadcasts at frequencies around 1 million hertz, 1 million oscillations per second. An FM station broadcasts at roughly 100 million hertz. A cell phone operates at several billion hertz. These frequencies work beautifully in air. They propagate through the atmosphere at the speed of light, bouncing off the ionosphere, diffracting around hills, penetrating buildings. The entire modern world runs on radio waves traveling through air. Seawater is different. Seawater is a conductor, an electrolyte, rich in dissolved salts that absorbs electromagnetic energy with ruthless efficiency. When a radio wave enters seawater, the electrically charged ions in the water begin to oscillate in response to the wave's electric field. This oscillation converts the wave's energy into heat. The wave is absorbed. It dies. The higher the frequency, the faster it dies. A standard military VHF radio signal operating at 30 to 300 megahertz is effectively absorbed within inches of the ocean's surface. It might as well not exist for a submarine at any operational depth. Lower frequencies penetrate deeper. This is the key insight, and it is the foundation of everything that follows. The lower the frequency of a radio wave, the less efficiently seawater absorbs it, and the deeper it can penetrate before its energy is dissipated. VLF signals, very low frequency, in the range of 3 to 30 kilohertz, can penetrate seawater to a depth of roughly 10 to 30 meters. Since World War II, navies have used VLF transmitters to communicate with submarines. But to receive a VLF signal, a submarine must rise to just below the surface or trail a shallow antenna buoy behind it on a cable, a long, thin wire that floats near the surface and picks up the incoming signal. In either case, the submarine must approach the surface. It must slow down. It must behave in a way that makes it detectable. The entire point of a submarine is to be invisible, and VLF communication required it to become partially visible at regular intervals. During the Cold War, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a strategic vulnerability of the first order. To understand the weight of this vulnerability, you have to understand the nuclear triad, the three-legged structure on which American nuclear deterrence rested. The first leg was the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Minutemen and Titan missiles, housed in hardened silos scattered across the Great Plains of Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Missouri. These missiles could reach Soviet targets in 30 minutes. They were accurate, reliable, and always ready. They were also fixed in place. The Soviets knew exactly where every American ICBM silo was located. Every silo was targeted by Soviet warheads. In a first strike, the silos would be among the first destroyed.
The second leg was the Strategic Bomber Force, the B-52s of the Strategic Air Command, loaded with nuclear weapons, stationed at bases across the United States. The bombers could reach any target on Earth, and they carried enough weapons to devastate the Soviet Union. But they were slow. Hours to reach their targets compared to minutes for a missile. And they were vulnerable on the ground. A bomber sitting on a runway was a bomber that could be destroyed by a Soviet warhead before it took off. SAC maintained a portion of its force on airborne alert during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, but keeping nuclear-armed bombers in the air 24 hours a day was expensive, exhausting, and, as the Palomares incident of 1966 demonstrated, occasionally catastrophic. The third leg was the submarine fleet. And the submarine fleet was the leg that mattered most because it was the leg that could not be destroyed. A ballistic missile submarine, an SSBN carrying 24 Trident missiles, each missile carrying multiple independently targetable warheads, was, for all practical purposes, invisible. It operated in the deep ocean, below the thermocline layer that confounded enemy sonar, moving at speeds slow enough to produce no detectable noise. The Soviet Union spent decades and billions of rubles trying to develop the capability to track American ballistic missile submarines. They failed.
No Soviet technology of the Cold War era could reliably locate, track, and destroy an American SSBN at its patrol depth. The submarines were invulnerable. This invulnerability was the foundation of deterrence. As long as the Soviet leadership knew that American submarines would survive a first strike and would be capable of retaliating, the rational calculation for launching a first strike always came out negative. The cost of retaliation would always exceed any conceivable gain from striking first. The submarines guaranteed mutual destruction. Mutual destruction guaranteed peace. It was a hideous logic, but it was the logic that prevented nuclear war for 40 years. But the logic had a flaw, and the flaw was communication. The submarines were invulnerable because they were hidden. They were useless unless they could be reached, and no one could communicate with them while they were doing the thing that made them survivable, hiding deep in the ocean, far below the reach of ordinary radio signals. This was the paradox that kept defense planners awake at 3 in the morning. The submarines were invulnerable. They were also, at their operating depth, death. They could not hear the order to respond to a Soviet first strike unless they rose toward the surface, and rising toward the surface was the one thing that might get them killed. What if the Soviet Union developed a way to detect submarines as they came up to receive messages? What if the Soviets timed their first strike to coincide with the scheduled communication windows, catching the submarines shallow and vulnerable? What if a submarine commander, unable to receive any communication for days, concluded on his own that the United States had been destroyed and launched independently, starting a nuclear war that no one in the surviving American command structure had authorized? The Navy needed a way to talk to submarines at their normal operating depth, hundreds of feet below the surface, without requiring the submarines to do anything that might reveal their location. The answer, if it existed, lay at the extreme bottom of the electromagnetic spectrum. The man who first proposed the solution was a physicist named Nicholas Christopoulos, a self-taught Greek-American scientist who worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in the late 1950s. Christopoulos was not a radio engineer. He was a particle physicist, a man who had already achieved fame for independently discovering the principle of strong focusing in particle accelerators and for proposing the Argus experiment, which detonated nuclear weapons in space to study the Earth's magnetic field. He was a man who thought about electromagnetic phenomena at scales that conventional engineers did not consider. He understood that extremely low-frequency radio waves, ELF, in the frequency range of 30 to 300 Hz, could penetrate seawater to depths of hundreds of meters. At 76 Hz, the frequency that Project ELF would ultimately use, the signal could reach submarine depths that VLF could not approach. The first real test came in 1962 and 1963, before any dedicated facility existed. A company called DECO leased a 70-kilometer power line in Wyoming and used it as a makeshift ELF antenna. The results were promising enough to justify a larger test. In 1963, the Navy strung a purpose-built wire antenna 176 kilometers long between West Virginia and North Carolina. They pumped 60 amperes of current through it at various ELF frequencies between 4 and 500 Hz. The radiated power was approximately 1 watt, and at a distance of 3,200 kilometers in the North Atlantic, the submarine USS Seawolf detected the signal, moving at 6 knots at a depth of 150 feet. 1 watt received through 3,200 kilometers of atmosphere and ocean. The physics worked. A second test detected the signal at 2,500 miles with the submarine moving at 18 knots at 150 feet of depth. The principle was proved. What remained was to build a system that could do it reliably, continuously, and at a scale sufficient for operational use. That is where the ambition and the controversy began. The catch was the antenna. A radio antenna operates most efficiently when its physical length is comparable to the wavelength of the signal it transmits. The wavelength of a 76 Hz signal is approximately 3,950 kilometers, roughly 2,450 miles. An efficient antenna for this frequency would need to be hundreds or thousands of miles long. No one was going to build a 2,000-mile antenna, but Christophilos had an idea that bordered on genius and madness simultaneously. What if the Earth itself were the antenna? His proposal, which became Project Sanguine, was breathtaking in its ambition. Bury 6,000 miles of heavy electrical cable in a grid pattern across the bedrock of northern Wisconsin. Ground the cables at their ends. Pump alternating current through them at 76 Hz. The current would flow through the cables and then return through the earth, through the deep bedrock beneath Wisconsin, forming enormous current loops that extended hundreds of feet into the ground. These current loops would function as the radiating element of a dipole antenna, not the cable itself, but the earth beneath the cable. The planet would become the antenna. The bedrock of Wisconsin would broadcast to the submarines of the Pacific and the Atlantic. The system would be virtually unjammable. ELF signals are so simple and so powerful that overwhelming them with interference would require a transmitter of comparable size, and no enemy possessed one. It would survive a nuclear attack. The original design called for the cables to be buried in hardened bunkers, powered by underground generators, so that even if the surface were devastated by nuclear weapons, the system would continue to transmit. The submarines would know that if they could still hear the ELF signal, the United States still existed in some functional form. And if the signal stopped, they would know what that meant, and they would know what to do.
Project Sanguine was proposed in 1968. The scale of the proposal was staggering. The antenna grid would cover 22,500 square miles, 41% of the state of Wisconsin. 6,000 miles of buried cable, 100 underground power plants in concrete bunkers, 800 megawatts of electrical consumption, billions of dollars in construction costs. The project would have been, by some measures, the largest single construction project in American military history. It was never built. The opposition was immediate and ferocious. Environmental groups warned that the enormous ground currents would disrupt the ecology of northern Wisconsin, killing earthworms, disorienting migratory birds, interfering with fish spawning, contaminating groundwater with electromagnetic fields whose biological effects were unknown. Anti-war groups saw the project as an escalation of nuclear war capability. Farmers feared the effect on their livestock and crops. Politicians from Wisconsin, led by Senator Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day, fought the project for years. The Navy's own environmental impact studies were inconclusive, which was worse than being negative, because inconclusiveness allowed every interest group to project its worst fears onto the data. The Navy retreated. It proposed a smaller system called Project Seafarer, 2,400 miles of cable over 4,700 square miles. Seafarer was also defeated. Then came austere ELF in 1978, also defeated. Finally, in 1981, the Navy received approval for a system so drastically scaled down from the original Sanguine proposal that it was almost a different concept entirely. Project ELF would consist of 2 transmitter facilities, one at Clam Lake, Wisconsin, in the Chequamegon National Forest, and one at Republic, Michigan, in the Copper Country State Forest. Instead of 6,000 miles of buried cable, there would be 84 miles of above-ground transmission line, ordinary-looking cables strung on ordinary-looking utility poles through clearings cut in the forest. The Wisconsin facility would have 2 14-mile antenna lines arranged in a cross. The Michigan facility would have 3 lines, 2 14 miles long and 1 28 miles long, arranged in the shape of the letter F. The 2 facilities, separated by roughly 150 miles, were connected by underground cable and operated in synchronization as a single antenna system. The combined signal was stronger than either facility could produce alone, but it was still extraordinarily weak by any conventional radio standard. The total radiated power of the entire system, both facilities operating at their full input of 2.6 megawatts, was approximately 8 watts. 8 watts to reach submarines on the other side of the planet.
The reason it worked, the reason 8 watts could do what seemed physically impossible, lay in the unique properties of ELF propagation. At 76 Hz, the radio wave produced by the Project ELF antenna was 3,950 kilometers long. A wave this long does not behave like ordinary radio. It does not travel in a straight line from transmitter to receiver. It fills the natural waveguide formed between the surface of the Earth and the lower boundary of the ionosphere, the electrified layer of the atmosphere that begins roughly 60 kilometers above the surface. The ELF wave propagates within this Earth ionosphere waveguide with remarkably little loss, only 1 to 2 decibels per 1,000 kilometers, compared to tens or hundreds of decibels per 1,000 kilometers for higher frequency signals. This meant that an ELF signal transmitted from Wisconsin could propagate around the entire planet with relatively little attenuation. A submarine in the Indian Ocean could receive a signal from Michigan. A submarine under the Arctic ice cap could receive a signal from Wisconsin. The signal was weak, it was slow, it carried almost no information, but it reached everywhere. The submarines received the signal using a trailing wire antenna, a long, thin cable deployed from the submarine and towed behind it. The antenna was hundreds of feet long, and the submarine towed it at depth, eliminating the need to approach the surface. The received signal was extracted from the noise using sophisticated signal processing. The incoming 8 watts of ELF energy spread across the entire planet and mixed with the natural electromagnetic noise of thunderstorms and the Earth's own geomagnetic activity had to be separated from the background by electronics that could detect a signal buried in noise the way a bat detects an insect in a thunderstorm. The data rate was agonizingly slow. At 76 Hz, the available bandwidth was measured in fractions of a hertz. The system could transmit about 3 characters per minute. A typical message, a 3-letter code, took 15 minutes to send. The message content was minimal, a coded instruction to the submarine commander, typically telling him to surface to periscope depth and receive a more detailed message via VLF or satellite communication. Project ELF was not a communication system in any conventional sense. It was a bell. It rang, and the submarine came to the surface to answer the telephone. But the bell could ring through the ocean, through the ice, through a nuclear war, through anything. And that was enough. The Soviets built their own. The Russian Navy constructed a comparable ELF transmitter system called ZEVS, Russian for Zeus, located on the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, at a site chosen for the same geological reason that Wisconsin and Michigan were chosen, the presence of ancient, low-conductivity bedrock that forced the antenna currents deep underground. ZEVS operated at an even lower frequency than the American system, 82 Hz, and used a similar above-ground antenna configuration. Like its American counterpart, ZEVS communicated with the Soviet ballistic missile submarine fleet, the Typhoon-class and Delta-class boats that patrolled the Arctic and the Pacific, carrying enough warheads to destroy the United States several times over. The existence of ZEVS was one of those Cold War symmetries that made the entire enterprise feel like a mirror image reflected in dark water. Both sides had built the same impossible thing, a planetary radio system operating at the edge of physics, transmitting signals too weak to measure with ordinary instruments, reaching submarines too deep for any other technology to contact. Both sides had done it for the same reason, to ensure that if everything else was destroyed, the submarines would receive the order to complete the destruction. Each ELF system existed to guarantee the annihilation of the other side's civilization. Each system justified the other's existence. The logic was circular, self-reinforcing, and inescapable. For the men aboard the submarines, the ELF signal was something between a lifeline and a ghost. A ballistic missile submarine on deterrent patrol operated in a condition of almost total isolation. The boat left port, submerged, and disappeared. For the duration of the patrol, typically 60 to 90 days, the crew had no contact with the outside world except through the communication systems. No telephone calls home, no letters, no news. The crew knew when they left port that their families would not hear from them until the patrol was over, and that they would hear nothing from their families. The submarine existed in a bubble of silence, surrounded by the deep ocean, disconnected from everything except the mission. The ELF receiver was monitored continuously. A petty officer in the radio room watched the equipment, waiting for the signal processor to extract a valid message from the background noise. The process was not dramatic. There was no alarm bell, no flashing light, no Hollywood moment. The signal processor ran continuously, grinding through the incoming electromagnetic noise, looking for the 76 Hz pattern modulated between 72 and 80 Hz that indicated a valid ELF transmission. When a valid three-letter code was detected, it printed on a teletype. The radio operator verified the code, authenticated it against his codebook, and reported it to the officer of the deck. Most ELF messages were routine. The most common message was the instruction to come to periscope depth and receive a more detailed communication via VLF or satellite. This might mean a change in patrol area, a schedule adjustment, a weather advisory, or an administrative matter. The crew would come shallow, receive the full message, and return to depth. Life continued. But every man aboard knew that one day the three-letter code might be different. It might be the code that meant the war had started, the code that meant the silos were empty, the bombers were airborne, the cities were burning, and the submarines were the last functioning element of American military power. The code that meant it was their turn to launch. They trained for this. They drilled for this. They maintained the missiles for this. Every crew member, from the commanding officer to the most junior seaman, understood that the purpose of their patrol was to carry weapons that must never be used and to be prepared to use them if ordered. The ELF signal was the thread that connected them to that order. It was the thinnest thread imaginable. 8 watts, 3 characters per minute, 15 minutes to deliver. But it was strong enough to carry the heaviest message a human being could receive. The crew did not talk about this, not directly, not in the way that civilians imagine. They talked about their families, about sports, about the food, about the minor irritations of living with 150 men in a steel tube for 3 months. They did not sit around discussing nuclear annihilation. They did not need to. The missiles were in the tubes, the targeting data was in the computers, the ELF receiver was in the radio room. The knowledge of what they were there to do was always present, like the hum of the reactor, like the pressure of the sea against the hull. It was the background condition of their existence. They lived with it the way people in earthquake country live with the fault line beneath their house. Aware of it, prepared for it, unable to prevent it, hoping it never happens. The facilities themselves were modest to the point of anticlimax. A visitor to the Clam Lake transmitter, if a visitor were permitted, which generally they were not, would have found a small single-story building in a forest clearing, surrounded by the kind of fencing you might see around a rural electrical substation. Inside were the transmitter equipment, the power conditioning systems, and the control room where 2 civilian employees of the Naval Computer and Telecommunications Area Master Station Atlantic monitored the system. 2 employees. For one of the most strategically significant communication systems in the American nuclear arsenal. The antenna lines radiated outward from the building, 14-mile cables strung on poles through clearings 70 to 100 feet wide cut through the Chequamegon National Forest. The clearings looked like power line rights-of-way, and they were maintained the same way. Trees and brush cut back, the ground kept clear. Beneath the antenna lines, wildflowers and grasses grew in the sunlight that the absent trees allowed to reach the forest floor. The Navy discovered, with some amusement and some public relations benefit, that the Clam Lake antenna clearings had become prime habitat for the Wisconsin elk herd. The small, reintroduced population of elk that roamed the Chequamegon National Forest found the open ground beneath the ELF lines ideal for grazing. The world's most powerful submarine communication antenna doubled as an elk pasture. The Republic, Michigan facility was similar, a small transmitter building and 3 antenna lines radiating through the forest, the longest of them 28 miles from end to end. The two facilities were connected by a 165-mile underground cable that synchronized their operations. When both transmitters operated together, their combined signal was significantly stronger than either alone, because the two antenna systems, separated by 150 miles, functioned as elements of a phased array, a concept borrowed from radar engineering applied at a scale that would have astonished the radar engineers who invented it. The system was controlled remotely from Norfolk, Virginia. Messages to be transmitted were generated by the Navy's command authority, encoded and sent to the transmitter facilities via secure landline. The transmitters converted the coded message into the binary modulated 76 Hz signal, the frequency shifting slightly between 72 and 80 Hz to encode ones and zeros, and broadcast it through the antenna lines, through the ground, through the bedrock, through the waveguide between the Earth and the ionosphere, through the ocean, to the submarines. The system was maintained around the clock every day for 15 years. The antenna lines had to be inspected regularly. Ice storms, fallen trees, and the occasional act of protest. Activists cut down antenna poles on several occasions, briefly interrupting transmission, required constant attention. The transmitter equipment, which operated at power levels that stressed every component, required ongoing maintenance. The underground cable connecting the two sites had to be monitored for faults. The entire system was, operationally, a continuous exercise in keeping a fragile, overworked piece of infrastructure alive in a remote forest, attended by a handful of people in service of a mission that the rest of the country preferred not to think about. The system's opponents never stopped fighting it. From the first proposal of Project Sanguine in 1968 to the final shutdown of Project ELF in 2004, the ELF transmitters were the target of protests, lawsuits, legislative challenges, and occasional acts of sabotage that ranged from symbolic to genuinely disruptive. Activists cut down antenna poles with chainsaws on multiple occasions, briefly interrupting transmission. Others chained themselves to the poles. Others filed lawsuits that wound through the federal courts for years. The Clam Lake facility became a pilgrimage site for the anti-nuclear movement, a physical place where the abstract horror of nuclear deterrence was made tangible, where you could stand in a Wisconsin forest and point at a wire on a pole and say, "That wire carries the signal that ends the world." Environmentalists argued that the ground currents, hundreds of amperes flowing through the bedrock, were disrupting the local ecosystem. The concerns were not frivolous. ELF electromagnetic fields are in the same frequency range as the brainwave patterns of many animals, and the theoretical possibility of interference with animal navigation, communication, and reproduction was real enough to demand investigation. Studies were commissioned. Researchers monitored earthworm populations, bird migration patterns, fish spawning behavior, deer movement, plant growth, and soil chemistry in the vicinity of the antenna lines. The results, accumulated over more than a decade, were ambiguous. The National Research Council evaluated the environmental data in 1997 and concluded that no significant ecological effects had been demonstrated, but acknowledged that the monitoring program had limitations and that absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. The protesters were not reassured. The ambiguity itself was their strongest argument. If the Navy could not prove the system was safe after a decade of study, perhaps it wasn't. Anti-war activists saw the system as an instrument of nuclear annihilation, a machine designed to make Armageddon more efficient. Their reasoning was straightforward. Project ELF existed to ensure that American submarines could receive the order to launch nuclear missiles even after the United States itself had been destroyed. Anything that made nuclear retaliation more certain made nuclear war more thinkable. The system's defenders argued the opposite, that reliable communication with the submarine fleet made nuclear deterrence more stable because it reduced the risk that a submarine commander, cut off from communication and uncertain whether the United States still existed, might launch independently based on an assumption rather than an order. Without ELF, the absence of communication itself could become a trigger. With ELF, silence meant silence, not destruction. Both arguments had merit. Neither resolved the fundamental moral question that Project ELF embodied. Is it acceptable to spend billions of dollars building a system whose sole purpose is to ensure that if civilization is destroyed, the destruction will be mutual? The system had no peacetime utility. It could not be repurposed for commercial use. It could not send weather reports or stock prices or love letters. It existed for one scenario and one scenario only, the end of the world as we know it. And the people who lived near it, in the small towns of northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula, who drank the water that flowed through the ground beneath the antenna, who hunted the deer that grazed beside the antenna poles, who raised their children within the electromagnetic field that the antenna produced, these people lived in the shadow of that scenario every day, whether they thought about it or not. In 2004, the Navy shut down both ELF transmitters. The official explanation was that VLF communication technology had improved to the point that the ELF system was no longer necessary. Newer, more capable submarine communication systems, including satellite-based systems and improved VLF receivers, had reduced the dependence on the ELF bell ringer. The antenna lines were de-energized. The transmitter buildings were decommissioned. The clearing crews stopped maintaining the rights of way. Today, if you drive the back roads of the Chickamauga National Forest near Clam Lake, Wisconsin, or the state forests near Republic, Michigan, you can still find the clearings. The poles are gone, removed or fallen. The wire is gone, salvaged or rusted. But the clearings remain, slowly narrowing as young trees encroach from both sides, the forest reclaiming what was taken from it. In another 20 years, the clearings will be indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. In 50 years, no trace will remain. The elk still graze there, the wildflowers still grow. The bedrock beneath, the ancient Precambrian granite of the Canadian Shield, 1.7 billion years old, the same formation that shelters NORAD inside Cheyenne Mountain 1,000 miles to the southwest, is silent. No current flows through it, no signal radiates from it. The Earth, which was briefly conscripted as a radio antenna, has been honorably discharged. But the submarines are still out there. The Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, the most powerful weapons platforms ever built, still patrol the deep ocean, still carrying enough nuclear warheads to destroy any nation on Earth. They communicate now by other means, satellite, VLF, techniques that remain classified. The problem that Project ELF was built to solve, how do you talk to a machine that hides beneath the sea, has not gone away. It has been answered differently. But the question persists because the submarines persist, and the deterrence persists, and the terrible logic that produced an antenna 28 miles long in a Michigan forest has not been repealed by the passage of time or the improvement of technology. The question was first asked in 1942 by a submarine commander in the Pacific who surfaced at night to receive his orders and saw, on the horizon, the silhouette of a Japanese destroyer that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The question was asked by every skipper who weighed the value of a message against the risk of being caught shallow. The question was asked by every radio man who sat in the cramped radio shack of a Gato-class boat, listening to the static, waiting for the VLF signal from Jim Creek or Pearl Harbor, knowing that every minute on the antenna was a minute of vulnerability. The question was, how do we hear without being seen? It took 50 years to answer. 6,000 miles of cable was proposed. 84 was built. 2 transmitters in the northern forest. 8 watts of output from 2.6 million watts of input. 3 characters per minute. A message shorter than a tweet, carrying the weight of civilization. The answer was absurd. The answer was genius. And the answer began in the radio shacks of submarines that fought the Pacific War 80 years ago, in the gap between submerging and communicating, between safety and knowledge, between silence and the order that might save or end the world. 8 watts. 76 Hertz, 3 characters per minute. An antenna longer than Manhattan, powered by a small city, transmitting through the bones of the continent, reaching a submarine at the bottom of the ocean on the other side of the planet. A message that could end the world, carried by a signal too weak to light a room. That is what America built in the forest. That is what the elk grazed beneath. That is what the protesters tried to stop, and the Navy fought to keep, and the physics demanded, and the Cold War required. A whisper from Wisconsin to the abyss, a bell that rang beneath the waves. The bell is silent now. The forest is growing back. The submarines are still listening.